The sky turned dark as a colossal alien fleet loomed over Earth, their massive warships blocking out the sun. People across the world stared up in horror, watching as the ominous vessels remained perfectly still. No weapons fired, no demands were made, only an eerie silence filled the air. Governments scrambled for answers, launching emergency meetings, but nothing could explain why an entire alien armada had suddenly arrived without warning. Panic spread like wildfire. Social media exploded with theories. Some believed it was an invasion, while others hoped for peaceful contact. But then, the aliens broadcasted a single message across every device, every television, every screen on the planet. The deep, unnatural voice echoed through the world. We seek the one who must never awaken. No one knew what it meant. Scientists analyzed the transmission, but there was no hidden code, no demands. The aliens simply hovered above, waiting. Fear gripped the world. What were they looking for? Who was the one? And why was their awakening such a terrifying possibility? Far from the chaos, in a quiet suburban neighborhood, a young boy named Ethan sat on his bed, staring at the screen of his tablet. His parents were in the living room, murmuring about the strange events. But Ethan wasn't focused on the news. His hands trembled slightly, his heart racing for reasons he didn't understand. His head hurt, a dull ache that pulsed behind his eyes. Then, without warning, his tablet flickered and shut off. The lights in his room dimmed, and for a brief moment, the entire house lost power. A strange warmth spread through his chest. He clutched his hands together, feeling something deep inside him stir. Something ancient, something powerful. A knock at his door startled him. His mother peeked in, her face lined with worry. "Ethan, are you okay?" The lights just. Her eyes widened as she saw the faint glow beneath his fingertips. The color drained from her face. Ethan quickly hid his hands under the covers. I don't know what happened," he stammered. His mother didn't say anything at first. She just stood there, staring at him as if seeing him for the first time. Then, with a forced smile, she stepped inside, brushing back his messy hair. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered, but her voice trembled. Downstairs, his father was glued to the television. New reports had come in. The alien fleet was scanning the planet, searching. Government officials were urging calm, but the world was already spiraling into fear. And then the unthinkable happened. One of the largest alien ships suddenly trembled in the sky. It shuddered violently, as if struck by an unseen force. A ripple of energy burst outward, and the ship, one that was powerful enough to obliterate entire cities, retreated. The world watched in shock as one by one, the other ships began pulling back. The invaders, the unstoppable force that had arrived in overwhelming numbers, were fleeing. The message changed. The one has stirred. We must leave before it is too late. Confusion erupted across the planet. Why were the aliens running? What could possibly scare a civilization powerful enough to subjugate entire star systems? Ethan, unaware of the chaos unfolding, clutched his chest as a strange symbol glowed faintly on his skin for just a moment before fading away. He didn't understand what was happening to him, but deep inside, he felt something, waiting. And the universe had just realized it, too. Ethan lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling. His mind replayed the events of the day over and over. The alien fleet had come. The world had panicked. And then, without any reason anyone could understand, they had left. Not just left, but fled. Something had scared them so much that they abandoned their overwhelming advantage without firing a single shot. And somehow, deep inside, Ethan felt like he already knew the answer. His mother had barely spoken to him after seeing the glow beneath his fingertips. She had tried to hide her fear, but Ethan could see it in her eyes. His father, oblivious to what had happened upstairs, had spent the night watching news reports. Scientists were scrambling for answers, politicians were trying to keep order, and the entire world was drowning in uncertainty. But Ethan had felt something in that moment, a strange warmth spreading through his veins, something ancient and powerful stirring inside him. He had always been an ordinary kid. He went to school, played video games, and did his homework. There was nothing special about him, until now. The clock on his nightstand flickered, the red numbers shifting strangely before resetting to 0. The streetlights outside his window pulsed like a heartbeat. Ethan sat up quickly, his breath shallow. He reached out, his fingers trembling, and as he did, the entire room felt like it shifted around him. Then it was gone. The air stilled. The lights steadied. The clock returned to its normal display. But Ethan's hand still tingled with a strange energy. He barely slept that night. By morning, the news had taken a wild turn. Governments had managed to decode part of the alien transmission, but the results only led to more questions. Every analysis pointed to one terrifying conclusion. The aliens had not come to invade. They had come to find something. To stop something. Somewhere on Earth, they believed, was a being so powerful that even they, with their advanced weapons and unmatched technology, could not risk facing it. Ethan sat at the breakfast table, barely touching his cereal. His mother's hands trembled as she poured coffee. She had been quiet all morning, glancing at him when she thought he wasn't looking. His father, still groggy from staying up late, rubbed his temples and muttered something about the world going insane. Ethan's little sister, Emma, kicked her feet under the table, oblivious to the tension in the air. "Are the aliens gonna come back?" she asked between bites of toast. "No," their father said firmly. "Not after running like that." He shook his head. Cowards. All that power, and they just left. Ethan swallowed hard. Later that afternoon, the doorbell rang. His mother tensed as she peeked through the blinds. A black SUV sat in the driveway. Several men in suits stood at the front door. She turned to Ethan. "Go upstairs," she whispered. "But now." Ethan hesitated, then obeyed, rushing up the steps just as his mother opened the door. He pressed his ear to the floorboards, listening. "Mrs. Carter," a deep voice said, "we need to speak with your son." His mother's voice was calm but firm. "Why?" There was a pause. "We believe he may be connected to the recent events." Ethan's heartbeat pounded in his ears. His mother didn't answer right away. Finally, she said, "He's just a boy." "Ma'am," the agent said, lowering his voice, "this isn't just about Earth anymore. The aliens weren't here for war. They were here for something else, and we believe your son may be the reason they left." Silence stretched between them. Ethan barely breathed. Finally, his mother said, "I think you should leave." The men hesitated, then, without another word, turned and walked back to their car. The SUV pulled out of the driveway, disappearing down the street. Ethan let out a shaky breath. That night, after Emma had gone to bed and his father was watching the news again, his mother sat beside him in his room. She took his hand gently and turned it over. The strange glow was gone, but she didn't seem reassured. "Ethan," she whispered, "there's something I need to tell you." His stomach clenched. "You were adopted." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He stared at her, unable to process the words. "You were different when we found you," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "We never knew why. But now," she looked away, "now I think I understand." Ethan's head spun. He had never once questioned where he came from. His whole life, his parents were just his parents. His family was just his family. But now, as the world spiraled into fear over an unknown force, he was being told that he wasn't really a part of it. A chill ran through him. Somewhere out there, in the vast darkness of space, an entire alien armada had run in terror, and it hadn't been because of Earth. It had been because of him. Ethan sat in his room, his thoughts a tangled mess of fear, confusion, and disbelief. The weight of his mother's words pressed down on him. He had always believed he was just an ordinary kid, no different from anyone else. But now, Everything he thought he knew about himself was falling apart. Adopted. Different. The aliens hadn't come for war. They had come for him. He tried to breathe, but every time he closed his eyes, the same thoughts played over and over. Why had they been afraid? What was inside him that could scare an entire alien armada? He had no answers, only more questions. Downstairs, his parents spoke in hushed voices, their concern thick in the air. His mother wanted to keep him hidden, to protect him from whatever was coming. His father, always the practical one, insisted that they couldn't keep something like this a secret forever. But they had no idea what they were dealing with. The next morning, the world was still in chaos. Every news channel talked about the alien retreat, but no one could explain why it had happened. Scientists and military experts speculated endlessly, but no theory made sense. The government remained silent, fueling even more panic. People demanded answers, afraid the aliens would return. But Ethan knew the truth. The aliens wouldn't come back, not after what they had sensed. And yet he felt watched. At school, whispers filled the hallways. Conspiracy theories ran wild. Some students joked about the aliens being allergic to Earth's atmosphere. Others believed the whole thing was a government cover-up. But Ethan wasn't laughing. Every moment, every breath, something inside him felt unsettled, as if something was waking up. The headaches started soon after. Sharp, pulsing pain behind his eyes, like something clawing to get out. He barely made it through class, his vision blurring at the edges. At lunch, as he sat alone, trying to push down the growing fear, he heard something. A voice. But no one was speaking. It was inside his head. Ethan jolted upright, his tray clattering to the floor. The noise in the cafeteria faded away, replaced by something else, a whispering, echoing presence that wasn't his own. He is awakening. His breath hitched. He turned, scanning the cafeteria, but no one was looking at him. The voice wasn't coming from the students. It was coming from somewhere else, somewhere far away. The moment passed as quickly as it came, but Ethan knew something had changed. The tingling sensation in his fingers returned, and for the first time, he wasn't sure if he could control it. That night, he barely slept. His body felt strange, heavier somehow, as if he was carrying something he couldn't see. His mother hovered near his door, checking on him every hour, but she never said anything. She knew something was wrong. Then, at exactly 3:12 a.m., he woke up gasping. A bright blue light pulsed outside his window. Heart pounding, he crept to the glass and peered outside. A dark figure stood in his backyard, motionless, watching his house. Not human. Ethan's breath caught. The figure's body shimmered faintly, shifting in and out of the darkness like a mirage. An alien. Not the ones from the fleet. This one was different. Smaller, faster looking. Its limbs long and thin. And it was staring directly at him. Ethan stumbled backward, knocking over his lamp. The sound shattered the silence. He barely had time to process before the figure moved, faster than anything he had ever seen, and vanished into the night. His mother rushed in, her face pale. What happened? Ethan couldn't speak. His mind was still frozen on what he had just seen. There was something outside, he finally whispered. His mother's expression darkened. She ran to the window, scanning the yard. There was nothing there. No movement, no sign of anything. But Ethan knew what he had seen. Someone, or something, had been watching him. The next day, Ethan stayed home from school. His parents didn't argue. They knew something was wrong. His father called in sick to work and spent the morning triple-checking the locks on the doors and windows. His mother didn't let Ethan out of her sight. But it didn't matter. By nightfall, the sky had changed. Ethan stood on the porch, staring up at the stars. His skin tingled with an electric energy he didn't understand. He didn't know how, but he could feel something moving out there, beyond the sky. And then, just as he was about to turn away, The stars themselves seemed to shift. A shadow passed over the moon. A deep, unnatural hum filled the air, vibrating in his bones. And then, far in the distance, just on the edge of space, a second fleet appeared, larger than the first, darker. And this time, they weren't running. This time, they were coming for him. Ethan felt the air shift around him, thick with an unseen weight pressing down on his chest. The stars, once steady and eternal, seemed to pulse, vibrating with an energy he could feel in his bones. The new fleet, larger than the first, loomed just beyond the atmosphere like a silent storm gathering strength before the strike. He didn't need a news report to tell him what was happening. He could feel them. They were coming for him. He stumbled back into the house, his breath short. His mother stood by the kitchen table, staring at her phone with wide, terrified eyes. His father had the television on, the breaking news headline flashing in red across the screen. The world was watching. The world was afraid, but no one knew the real reason these ships were here. Except for Ethan. His mother turned to him, her hands trembling. "Ethan, we have to leave." His father looked up, confused. "Leave? Where? It's not like we can just run from." "They're looking for him," she whispered. "And this time, they're not going to just sit there and wait." Ethan knew she was right. The first fleet had been afraid, hesitant. They had scanned the planet and left when they felt whatever it was inside him stir. But these newcomers weren't afraid. He could sense it, an overwhelming presence in the back of his mind, like distant voices whispering through space. They were determined. They weren't going to run. His father still didn't understand. "Even if we leave, where would we go? They're coming to the planet, not just our house." "They don't know where he is yet," his mother said quickly. "If we move now, maybe." The lights flickered. A sharp, piercing static noise filled the air, rattling the windows. The television screen cut to black. His father grabbed the remote, trying to switch channels, but nothing worked. Every electronic device in the house glowed with a strange, pulsing light. Then a voice crackled through the speakers. Not human. Ethan Carter. His father froze. His mother clutched his arm, her face pale. The voice wasn't coming from the television or the radio. It was coming from every speaker at once. The house phone, the cell phones, even the baby monitor in Emma's room. "You are known. You are seen. You cannot hide." The lights in the house went out. The silence that followed was worse than the voice itself. Ethan's heart pounded. He could feel something in the air, a static charge pressing against his skin. And then, footsteps. Not from outside. From inside the house. His father moved first, grabbing the closest thing he could, a fire poker from beside the fireplace. His mother ushered Emma into the hallway, motioning for Ethan to follow. He could barely move, his legs frozen in place. The sound of footsteps grew louder, slow and deliberate. Then, a shadow moved across the living room. Not human. The figure stepped forward, revealing itself under the dim glow of the emergency lights from outside. It wasn't like the aliens from the first fleet. This one was different, taller, its body sleek and unnatural, its limbs too long, its skin dark and shifting like smoke. Two glowing eyes locked onto Ethan. His father swung the fire poker, but before it could land, the figure moved faster than anything humanly possible. The weapon passed through empty air, as if the creature had never been there. Then, in the blink of an eye, it reappeared behind them. Ethan barely had time to register the movement before a cold pressure wrapped around his mind. His knees buckled, and his vision blurred. And then, a flash. Images flooded his mind, too fast to understand. A vast, endless war fought across the stars. Planets burning. Beings like him, glowing with the same strange energy inside him, standing against an unstoppable force. And then the final image, a gate. A massive ancient structure floating in the void, pulsing with unimaginable power. Ethan gasped as the vision ended, stumbling back. The shadowy figure didn't move, only watching him. Then, in a voice that was both alien and eerily familiar, it spoke directly into his mind. "You were not meant to awaken." Pain shot through Ethan's skull. His mother's scream sounded distant. His father's voice was lost in the ringing inside his head. And then, a blast of energy erupted from him. The air cracked like thunder. The windows shattered outward, glass spraying into the yard. The shadowy figure vanished, as if the force of Ethan's power had erased it from existence. For a moment, everything was still. Then the house alarms began blaring. Sirens screamed in the distance. The emergency broadcast system activated across every device, repeating the same message over and over. "This is a global emergency. Please remain indoors. Do not attempt to engage. The invaders have landed." Ethan barely heard it. His body trembled, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. His mother clutched his shoulders, trying to speak, but the words wouldn't reach him. He had felt it. In that split second, when the energy had surged out of him, he had touched something massive, something far beyond Earth, beyond the invading ships, something waiting, and it had noticed him. The Second Fleet wasn't just here to capture him. They were here because they knew what he was capable of, and they were afraid he wasn't the only one. The world was no longer the same. In a single night, everything had changed. Ethan sat in the back seat of his father's speeding car, his heart pounding against his ribs. The shattered windows of their house were still fresh in his mind, the eerie voice that had whispered inside his skull still echoing. His mother sat beside him, gripping his wrist as if letting go would mean losing him forever. His little sister, Emma, was curled up in the seat beside her, too scared to cry. The highways were in chaos. People were abandoning their cars, running in all directions as massive black ships descended from the sky, blocking out the stars. The Second Fleet had landed, and this time, they weren't just watching. Ethan felt them before he saw them. A heavy, suffocating pressure filled the air, pressing against his chest. His skin tingled, his veins humming with energy. The First Fleet had feared him. These newcomers were different. They weren't afraid. They were prepared. A blinding flash lit up the sky behind them, followed by a deafening explosion. His father swerved, nearly losing control as a shockwave tore through the air. Ethan turned just in time to see a building collapse in on itself, reduced to nothing but dust and rubble. The invaders weren't here to negotiate. "Where are we going?" Ethan asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. His father tightened his grip on the wheel, his knuckles white. "Somewhere safe." "There is no safe place," his mother said, her voice shaking. Ethan didn't argue. He knew she was right. Up ahead, military convoys blocked the road, soldiers scrambling into position. Tanks lined the highway, their massive cannons aimed at the sky. A line of fighter jets screamed overhead, missiles streaking toward the descending alien warships. Ethan could feel the tension thick in the air, the fear radiating from the soldiers standing at the front lines. They had no idea what they were up against. The moment the first missile struck, Ethan knew it was a mistake. The lead alien ship barely flinched. The explosion rippled across its surface, absorbed into its shifting, dark exterior. And then, without warning, the warship retaliated. A beam of energy twice the size of a skyscraper ripped through the battlefield, incinerating everything in its path. The military had never stood a chance. Screams filled the air as soldiers scattered. More ships descended, their enormous forms blotting out the skyline. Strange, shimmering figures emerged from the wreckage. Alien warriors unlike anything the world had seen before. Their bodies were sleek and metallic, their faces devoid of emotion. They moved like liquid shadows, advancing through the chaos without hesitation. Ethan's father slammed the brakes, nearly crashing into an abandoned truck. "We can't go forward," he shouted. Ethan barely heard him. His vision blurred, his head pounding as something inside him stirred again. The same feeling from before, the surge of power, the strange warmth flooding his body. He could hear them. The invaders weren't just speaking to each other. They were speaking to him. Contain the anomaly. Do not allow him to reach the gate. Terminate if necessary. His breath caught. They weren't just here to capture him. They were here to erase him from existence. Before he could speak, a sudden force ripped the car from the ground. Ethan barely had time to scream as the entire vehicle was lifted into the air, spinning wildly before being slammed onto the pavement. The windows shattered. His mother's arms wrapped around Emma, shielding her from the impact. His father groaned, blood trickling from his forehead. Ethan barely felt the pain. The air around them crackled, warping and shifting like a mirage. And then, the world ripped open. A massive figure stepped through, a being so massive and inhuman that it barely fit the space between reality and whatever lay beyond. Its form was indistinct, shifting between solid and liquid, metal and smoke. Its eyes burned with a golden light, ancient and filled with purpose. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. The moment Ethan locked eyes with it, he understood. This wasn't just an invasion. This wasn't just about him. This was about something far older than Earth, something woven into the very fabric of the universe. The invaders weren't just here to kill him. They were here because they knew what he could become. And they were terrified of it. The being raised a single hand, and the world froze. Time itself shuddered, the air becoming thick and unmoving. Soldiers, fire, smoke, everything stilled, as if the entire planet had been caught in the grip of something beyond comprehension. Ethan tried to move, but his body refused to obey. The being took a step forward, the ground cracking beneath its weight. Its golden eyes bore into him, peeling away every layer of his existence, searching for something deep inside him. You are not ready. The words weren't spoken. They were implanted directly into Ethan's mind, an undeniable truth sinking into his soul. You were not meant to awaken. Ethan clenched his fists. Energy burned beneath his skin, an untapped force desperate to be freed. He could feel it pushing against whatever barriers had been placed inside him. Something old and powerful struggling to break free. The being watched him, waiting. Ethan took a shaky breath. Then he reached for it. The instant he did, the world exploded into light. A shockwave blasted outward, shattering whatever force had held time in place. The alien warships trembled, their sleek surfaces flickering as their defenses failed. The golden-eyed being staggered, its form glitching, as if Ethan's power had disrupted the very core of its existence. Ethan barely understood what was happening. All he knew was that, for the first time, they were afraid. The invaders began to retreat. Ships rose back into the sky, engines flaring as they abandoned their positions. The massive warship above them shifted, its dark mass trembling. The being in front of Ethan let out a sound that was not a voice, but something deeper, a pulse of energy that vibrated through the very fabric of space. And then, they were gone. Just like that. The ships, the warriors, the golden-eyed entity, vanished. The battlefield was silent. Ethan collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. His mother pulled Emma close, sobbing in relief. His father stared at the sky, his face pale with shock. The world had survived, but Ethan knew it wasn't over. Somewhere, beyond the stars, something was waiting. Something far worse. And now, it knew his name. Ethan sat on the edge of a ruined highway, staring up at the sky where the alien fleet had vanished. The air was still thick with the scent of burning metal, the shattered remains of military vehicles scattered around him. Fires flickered in the distance, casting long shadows over a battlefield that had suddenly been abandoned. The silence was overwhelming. His mother knelt beside him, holding Emma tightly, her arms wrapped protectively around her trembling daughter. His father, standing a few feet away, stared at the empty sky with hollow eyes, his hands still shaking. He had seen war before, but not like this. No one had. The invaders were gone, retreating just as quickly as they had arrived. Not because of Earth's defenses, not because of military resistance. They had left because of Ethan, because of something inside him that even he didn't understand. But he knew one thing: they would be back. The power that had surged through him, the force that had shaken the very fabric of reality, still hummed beneath his skin. He could feel it waiting, coiled like a serpent, ready to strike at a moment's notice. The golden-eyed being had tried to contain him, to stop whatever was awakening inside him. But it had failed. Now he was truly awake. He didn't know what that meant. He didn't know what he had become. But the universe did, and it was afraid. A low rumble in the distance broke the silence. Ethan turned his head, expecting to see more destruction, more collapsed buildings, maybe even another wave of alien ships returning. Instead, military vehicles rolled over the horizon. Black SUVs, armored transport trucks, and helicopters circling overhead. The government hadn't abandoned them after all. Or maybe they had been watching the entire time. The convoy stopped several yards away. Armed soldiers stepped out first, rifles raised, moving cautiously, as if approaching something volatile. A tall man in a dark suit emerged from the largest vehicle, his face unreadable. His eyes locked onto Ethan, scanning him with something between fear and fascination. "Ethan Carter," the man said, his voice calm but firm. "My name is Director Harrison. I'm with the United Nations Special Threat Division." Ethan remained silent. He could feel the unspoken tension in the air. They weren't here to save him. They were here because they didn't know what else to do. "You need to come with us," Harrison continued. "For your own safety." His mother tightened her grip on him. "He's just a child," she said, her voice trembling. "He's not a threat." Harrison's expression didn't change. "That's not for you to decide." Ethan exhaled slowly. The weight of everything crashed down on him all at once. He wasn't safe anymore. Not here. Not anywhere. The aliens had come for him, tried to erase him. Now, the people he had spent his entire life among, the humans he thought were his own, were treating him like something dangerous, like something they needed to contain. His fingers curled into fists. Energy crackled at his fingertips. "Ethan," his father warned. He forced himself to stay calm. Losing control wouldn't help. Not now. Not when the whole world was watching. He stood slowly, brushing the dust from his torn clothes. "If I go with you," he said carefully, "what happens to my family?" Harrison's lips pressed into a thin line. "They'll be protected." "You mean locked up?" Harrison didn't deny it. Ethan shook his head. "No." The soldiers around them tensed, their grips tightening on their weapons. Harrison sighed. "Ethan, listen to me. You don't understand what's happening." "I understand perfectly," Ethan interrupted. "You're afraid of me." For the first time, there was a flicker of something behind Harrison's otherwise unreadable gaze. Fear, uncertainty, maybe even regret. "You're right," the director admitted. "We are afraid. And we should be." The honesty caught Ethan off guard. "This isn't just about you," Harrison continued. "This is about the entire world. You saw what happened today. You saw what you did. You're not normal, Ethan. And whether you like it or not, you're connected to something bigger than all of us. Something we don't understand." Ethan clenched his jaw. "You think I don't know that?" Harrison took a step closer. "Then help us understand." The energy beneath Ethan's skin pulsed, responding to his emotions. He could hear something. Something distant, something calling to him from beyond the stars. The same force that had drawn the invaders here, the same power that had made them retreat. He wasn't just some anomaly. He was something more. The gate, the vision he had seen. The images of a war older than time itself. They weren't random. They were memories. Not his, but of something inside him. Something that had been asleep for a very, very long time. And now it was waking up. Ethan turned to his parents. His mother's eyes glistened with unshed tears, her expression pleading. His father looked torn, struggling between his fear for Ethan and his fear of losing him. "I have to go," Ethan said softly. "No," his mother whispered. "No, you don't." "I do." He swallowed hard. "I need to find out what I am." His father stepped forward. "You're our son." Ethan smiled sadly. "I'll always be your son." He turned back to Harrison. "But I'm something else too." Harrison studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right." Ethan exhaled. He didn't know where this path would lead him. He didn't know if he would ever come back. But he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The wind howled as Ethan stepped onto the black tarmac of the airstrip, his heartbeat steady despite the storm of uncertainty raging inside him. The military compound stretched out before him, a maze of fortified buildings, satellite dishes, and underground research bunkers. Soldiers lined the perimeter, their expressions unreadable behind their helmets and visors. Above, helicopters hovered like silent predators, their searchlights sweeping across the base. He wasn't a prisoner. Not yet. But he knew better than to mistake this for anything other than what it was, a containment zone. A place where they could study him, test him, and, if necessary, keep him under control. Ethan walked beside Director Harrison, his mother and father trailing behind, their presence barely acknowledged by the soldiers escorting them. Emma clung to their mother's leg, her eyes wide with fear, but she didn't speak. None of them did. Harrison led them inside, through a series of security doors, each one reinforced with steel and coated locks. The deeper they went, the colder the air became. Ethan could feel something beneath his feet, energy, humming in the floors, pulsing through the walls. They weren't just studying him. They were preparing for something. Finally, they entered a wide, sterile chamber lined with glowing panels of alien technology. Screens flickered with incomprehensible data, and holographic projections hovered in the air, displaying maps of deep space, strange symbols etched into their surfaces. At the center of the room stood a massive containment unit, its glass-like walls shimmering with an unnatural glow. Ethan didn't need to ask what it was for. They had built a prison for him. His mother gasped softly, her hand tightening around Emma's. His father's jaw clenched, his knuckles white at his sides. But Ethan remained still, his expression unreadable. "You've been preparing for this," he said quietly, his voice carrying through the room. "For someone like me." Harrison didn't deny it. "We didn't know exactly what we were preparing for," the director admitted, "but we knew something was coming." Ethan turned to him, his gaze sharp. The gate. The entire room fell silent. Harrison exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. "You saw it, didn't you?" Ethan nodded. "The vision started when they arrived," he said. "I saw a war, planets burning, beings like me fighting against something." His fingers curled into a fist, the energy beneath his skin crackling. "And I saw the gate. It's not just a door. It's a prison." Harrison's face darkened. "We believe it holds something," he said carefully. "Something that was locked away long before humanity even existed." Ethan's pulse quickened. "They weren't trying to destroy me," he murmured. "They were trying to stop me from reaching it." For the first time, true fear flickered in Harrison's eyes. "That's what we're afraid of," the director admitted. Ethan took a slow breath, his mind racing. The invaders had feared him, not because of what he was, but because of what he could become. They hadn't come to kill him out of malice. They had come because they knew that if he awakened, the gate might open. The realization sent a chill down his spine. If whatever was inside that prison got out, it wouldn't just be Earth that suffered. It would be everything. The alarms blared before anyone could speak. Red lights flashed across the control panels. Soldiers shouted, scrambling to their stations. The entire compound trembled as if the ground itself had begun to wake. Harrison's earpiece crackled with frantic voices. "We have incoming. multiple signals. It's them. Ethan felt it before he heard it. The air vibrated, charged with an overwhelming force that sent every nerve in his body screaming. They were here, but not the ones from before. Not the warriors. Not the fleet. Something worse. The containment unit in the center of the room flickered. Then it shattered. The explosion sent shards of glowing glass flying in every direction, but Ethan barely noticed. Because standing in the wreckage, rising from the broken remains of the prison meant to hold him, was something else entirely. It was him. Or rather, something that looked like him. A figure stood there, identical to Ethan in every way. His same face, his same body, but with one difference. Its eyes were empty, hollow, as if something had been locked away inside it for centuries, waiting to be freed. The soldiers reacted instantly, weapons raised. But before a single shot could be fired, the double moved. Ethan barely saw it happen. One moment, the soldiers were standing. The next, they were gone. No sound, no screams, just erased. Ethan staggered back, his breath catching in his throat. His parents were shouting, but their voices were distant. The walls of the compound cracked, the energy inside the room collapsing in on itself. The thing that looked like him turned its hollow gaze toward him and spoke. "You were never meant to wake up." Ethan's body locked up. The voice wasn't his. It wasn't even human. It was ancient. "You were supposed to be the key," the figure continued, stepping forward. "But now, you are the door." Ethan didn't understand. Not until the floor beneath them shattered, and the world fell into darkness. He was floating, drifting through a void that stretched endlessly in every direction. There was no sound, no light, only a presence, a voice whispering through the abyss. "Wake up." Ethan gasped, his lungs burning as if he had been drowning. He wasn't in the compound anymore. He wasn't anywhere. And yet, the presence was there, watching him, studying him, waiting. Ethan clenched his fists. He didn't know what he was. He didn't know what had brought him here. But he knew one thing. He wasn't afraid anymore. And if something was trying to use him, trying to make him the door to something even worse, he was going to slam it shut. For good. The void trembled. The presence recoiled. And Ethan opened his eyes. The battle wasn't over. It was just beginning.